Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Laura Osterman. I have here Professor Anastasiya Osipova, whom I'll introduce in a minute, Professor Artemy Romanov, and Professor Natalia Plagman. I'm going to be our moderator today, and Artemy and Natalia will be assisting with the Q&A. And so we're going to get started. And I'm very pleased to introduce Anastasiya Osipova. She is a specialist in Russian and East European 20th and 21st century culture. She has her PhD from New York University, the Department of Comparative Literature, and she is assistant professor of at the Department of Germanic and Slavic Literatures at the University of Colorado Boulder. She has published on Soviet literature and underground culture, and she's editor-in-chief of Cicada Press, which publishes bilingual editions of poems and plays from Eurasia and Eastern Europe. And she herself is also a translator. And we're really excited for the topic of her talk, which she proposed. It's called Russian Anti-War Protests and Forms of Resistance Today. We will be using the Q&A today, so please put your questions while she's talking and or after she finishes talking into the Q&A. You will see there where you can write your questions. We'll be monitoring them, and we will take those questions in oral form, or we might answer them in written form at the during the talk or at the end of the talk, or as the talk finishes. So with no further ado, I give the floor to Professor Osipova.
Thank you, Professor Osterman, for your introductions. And thank you, everyone who decided to join us today. Professor Osterman, I need to share my slides. So if you could stop your slide sharing. Okay, let me just put on my slides. 1 second. Is it working? Can somebody tell me?
It is.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So as you can probably tell, I cannot see the audience and I don't know who exactly is in attendance, but let me begin by saying that today's talk is addressed primarily to students. It will also be mostly about students, Russian youth who constitute the most vocal, most visible, and probably the most vulnerable group opposing Putin's regime and its invasion into Ukraine. Since the full-out war has begun on Thursday, February 24th, nearly daily protests have been taking place in Russia's major cities, and more than 13,000 people have been arrested, beaten, humiliated, and tortured in jail. My purpose today is not to establish comparisons between who is facing a greater danger, the people of Ukraine fighting off the Russian army, or those in Russia experiencing the escalating domestic police terror. After all, suffering is not a sport. But I do want to introduce you today to those who are our allies, those who we should be in dialogue with, and who embody the hope for a very different Russia than the one that we see today. And I would like to begin with a bit of a preface before I get to the subject of today's conversation. Just a month ago, in February, I was in Kiev, which is my hometown. I'm a Ukrainian citizen. The purpose of my visit there was to conduct research at the former KGB, now SBU archives, and to visit my parents and friends. Just a few words about the KGB archives in Kiev, a wonderful resource that I hope some of you might get a chance to use in the future. I hear that even though Russian army has been targeting the buildings of the Ukrainian Bureau of Defense that houses those archives. At least the digital section of them has been saved. As some of you might know, shortly after Perestroika happened in 1990, the collapse of the Soviet Union happened in 1991, KGB made its archives briefly open. And however, in Russia, they were very promptly closed. So these days, for a researcher to gain access to materials pertaining to Stalinist terror, one must prove that they have a direct family connection to a certain repressed relative. However, in contrast, Ukraine has made those archives fully publicly available in 2011. So until the beginning of war, all that one had to do was to write a very simple request to gain access to the criminal files of the NKVD and KGB, beginning with the late 1920s and dating up until the 1990s, so to the criminal files as well as to the personnel files of the KGB. So one of the files that I personally have requested upon this visit was that of Lev Kopelev, who was a prominent dissident, who would emerge as a prominent dissident in the 60s after his imprisonment. And he was a Jewish man born in Kharkiv, Ukraine. So he wound up spending 10 years in the Gulag. And the reason for that was that he refused to equate German culture with culture of fascism. So what happened is that Kopelev was, before war, he was a professor of German studies, a friend of Bertolt Brecht and other German anti-fascists. And during World War II, he was recruited to be a leader of the anti-propaganda campaign. He ran it successfully, but at the same time, he refused to see all German culture as enemy culture, and he would advocate for the validity to see the worth in continuing to study German language and not see enemies in all of its people. For that reason, he was tried on the suspicion of treason and sentenced to 10 years by Stalinist judges. So the reason why I mentioned the story of a dissident Jewish Ukrainian is because I believe it provides us with a good warning against succumbing to such crude logic of wartime censorship and temptation to hold an entire nation accountable for the crimes of its government. Let us not be like Stalinist judges who put a man into prison for refusing to equate all German culture and language with Nazism. I hope that you would resist making the same mistake and refuse to reduce the entirety of Russian culture to that of Putin and present-day Putin's government. Okay, so that was a lyrical introduction, if you will, and now we'll get a bit closer to the focus of my talk today, but even for that, I'll have to provide a bit of a prehistory. So the protesters in Russia have been getting younger and younger for some time now. Ever since the 2017 wave of anti-corruption demonstrations prompted by the revelation of Dmitry Medvedev's assets, it is the faces of students, middle school students, high school students, university undergraduates that one sees most frequently at the opposition rallies. And those young people have been experiencing increased police pressure from the authorities, from their teachers, and also seeing quite a lot of criminal persecution. One of the most outrageous examples of that happened just this February when a 16-year-old high school student, Nikita Uvarov, was sentenced to 5 years of colony, so prison, for allegedly forming an anarchist group with a criminal intent. Again, no criminal actions were committed. He was tried on intent alone. So again, Putin has lost or is losing the battle for young people. And right now it is them who are essentially constituting the main oppositional force and who are the first in line to be repressed, sentenced, and trialed for refusing to accept Russia's actions in Ukraine. Several years ago, a certain platform emerged as the main voice or one of the main voices for catalyzing student-run protests. And here I'm talking about a group called Doxa. So Doxa emerged as a student-run journal, and it was originally founded by an institute in Moscow called the Higher School of Economics. So it was run by philosophers, students studying computer programming, linguistics, and so on. And their uniting ideology was feminism. So they began this journal by trying to track cases of student harassment, violations of human rights in the university. However, very quickly, they emerged as not just a publication for this specific university or even just Moscow, but as a platform for all of Russia's youth movement, right? And in 2019, they put together a guide, sort of a practical guide as to how to behave if you are arrested at the protests or if you were brutalized by police. And at that, university got cold feet and cut off their funding. So since 2019, they have been funded through private donations. And you all can sign up and support Doxa. So in 2021, in April, so roughly a year ago, the offices of this journal were raided by the riot police. All of not only their computers were confiscated, but also the computers of their family. And this probably the takeaway slogan from this riot was the infamous immortal line of riot police who turned to Arsene, sorry, I'm blanking out his last name, one of the editors, turning to his bookshelf and asking why so many books, right? So books right now are used as incriminating evidence of a criminal intent. And the Doxa group still remain on trial. Their trial hearings are about to commence right now, but for this entire year, since April of 2021, they have been under domestic arrest. So officially, the court mandated that they be prohibited, quote, certain actions. And those certain actions involve using internet, having access to any technology, or leaving the house, save for 2 hours in the morning between the hours of 8 and 10, right? So that became a very, very kind of publicized case. And yet, Doxa defendants, there are 4 of them, managed to maintain a very lively internet presence throughout this year. 2 of them, Natasha Tishkevich, pictured here, and Nala Gutnikova, make daily Instagram posts through a press secretary, contribute to the ongoing publications on the Doxa platform and other cultural platforms in Russia through mediators, so they're not allowed to publish directly, and sort of emerged as very important figures for setting the tone of Russian youth oppositional culture. And just to give you an example, right a few weeks before Russia started bombing Ukraine, Doxa has organized an international initiative group that was meant to create an art exhibit and a series of art events that were supposed to be coterminous with their court hearings. And I was a member of this group. However, now protests, of course, take precedence, and that idea has been shelved. So what I found remarkable about this group and the general set of approaches and atmosphere and let's say oppositional stance that they cultivate is the ways in other strategies, which I find unique and new to Russian environment. So just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, so here on the slide, I have a quote from a poem written by Alla Gutnikova, one of Doxa's defendants, that she posted through a mediator on a website called Sigma. So she writes, I'll read the English translation. Stop it, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I have seen this film already. Nadia Telakonikova, raised fist, clenched jaw, no pasaran. Alexandra Dukhanina with the ribbon across her eyes. The astronaut is turning off the air supply. right? So what's happening here is that Alla Gutnikova, again, who is under house arrest, cut off from communication, is meditating on a gallery of figures of heroic women positioned in a kind of in the role of a martyr to the regime, somewhat heroic martyr. And she recognizes that she is, let's say, the next image in line, and she is quite jaded with this, right? Both with the sort of bad eternity of repressive roles created by the state, right? Yet another female victim. And we know that this, unfortunately, this gallery runs not even from Pussy Riot, but starts in the 1860s with the People's Will revolutionaries, or at least that's where we can start tracing it. So she feels a certain anxiety about being positioned into this sort of endlessly self-reproducing sequence, perhaps feels a certain anxiety and an imposter syndrome. And so what we see here is a bit of a disappointment or disillusionment and fatigue with this role that is seems to be always available to young people in Russia. Oh, and I forgot to mention that you all know who Nadia Tolokonnikova is, I'm sure, and Alexandra Dukhanina mentioned in Alla Gutnikova's poem is pictured on the slide here on the right. She was an 18-year-old girl who was arrested during the Bolotnaya protests around against Putin's inauguration in 2012. Okay, so so I would like to point out some of the strategies that were generated by this collective doxa over the last year and that become activated or mobilized right now during the last 2 weeks of anti-war protests. So the way I see them is that this collective and a general atmosphere that they create, or let's say a new way of being an activist, is that they position themselves equally against a model of Soviet dissidence against the regime, and also against this heroic activism that is familiar to us since the cases of Pussy Riot, Pavlensky, and this kind of martyred heroic activism as such. So whereas, let's say, if you think about Pussy Riot, there was a desire to create situations where the state would be teased or provoked into revealing the reality of its repressive apparatus and violence, incidences that would later be documented, circulated on media, in part or largely for the Western consumption, with the hope that maybe that will change something. We have none of that among the Doxa people, right? There's neither a desire to let's say, to stage instances of violent confrontation with the state. There are no illusions about the violent nature of the state, nor there is any illusions about the West. Right? There are no more hopes left that perhaps flirting with Western media might protect them or change anything about their situation. So instead, their energies and efforts are switched towards cultivating an emotional attitude of non-intimidation. One. Two, they are really working hard on building a technological media platforms that would be available and accessible to really mass population of youth. They're also providing instructions on how to take care of one's cybersecurity. And last but not least, they're really concerned with, let's say, what should probably described as self-care, right? They're trying to maintain the morale. They are creating images and videos that betray the ironic attitude to police, or sort of refusal to articulate their subjectivity solely vis-a-vis the confrontation with the police. They plan parties and raves, and doing everything to resist the culture of fear, right? So to see through the police rather than to dedicate one's energies into creating the confrontations with police. And at the same time, it's not all fun and games. They're also very serious about organizing large-scale legal and prison support resources and funds. They've collected a massive database about all the court cases and instances of persecution of school children and students across Russia, and they're trying to again track all the reports about the pressures that administration inside universities are putting onto students by threatening to expel them from the university or to expose them to the authorities should they attend protests. So in other words, here we see a very different persona of public persona of an activist. The new activist is vulnerable, not afraid to talk about their anxiety, about their anti-prescription medications. They're also publicizing practices like going to the gyms and kind of organizing dances in front of the court. However, they're also very serious about building a technological base that would allow to provide legal support and to those detained by Russian authorities, and also to organize protests or to encourage them. Okay, sorry. And in this sort of shift away from a heroic, the figure of heroic protester, they're not alone. And I just wanted to give you two examples of artists who are, in my mind, fall under this kind of similar category. So here on the slides, you have a photo of one of the performances by an artist named Katrina Nenasheva, who I would describe as belonging to, let's say, a third wave of actionism. So again, unlike the actionism of the 2000 teens, where once again, that was very, very dramatic, very much taken with the sort of romantic vision of an oppositional figure. Katrina Nenasheva in her performances lends her body to expressing the pain of institutionalized others. So most of her performances are dedicated to the exploration of oppressive institutions, such as prisons, orphanages, institutions for coercive institutions for mentally ill people. And she tries to embody them and do it publicly. So the photograph that you see here is from her 2015 performance, Do Not Be Afraid, where she spent, I think, a week walking around the city of Moscow wearing a uniform of a female prisoner. And the performance ended with her going onto the Red Square and shaving her head. So part of the performance was to document the alienation that she would be faced with while wearing this uniform, and also to bring people's attention to the existence of female prisoners. And the second photo on the slide is an artist, Daria Sirienko, who started a series of protests called the Quiet Demonstration, which involved her riding public transport with a sign that would have either a poem or a slogan or a kind of protest line written on it. And both of those women are right now in prison. So Daria Sirienko was arrested on very bogus charges right before war started. She was given 15 days. And Katrina Nenasheva was arrested, I believe, 7 days ago at an anti-war rally. So here you have her portrait. Once again, as with Doxa, she's finding the ways of communicating online, even from beyond the gates, and even despite the ban for internet communication, right? So other people help her. And just to kind of give you a sample here, the lines that she reported yesterday. I'll read them. Reach the equator of the prison term. In our cell, we practice boxing, read lectures on film directing, and conduct sessions of mutual psychological support at night. Wishing everyone strength, we're hanging on. Right? So all of that is just to remind you that prison became a reality for Russian oppositional youth, students, and artists quite some time ago. And they've been thinking of the ways of resisting the prospect or the horizon of prison from intimidating people to stop, to prevent them from action, right? And of course, all of those activities are contingent upon having access to the internet. Right. However, last week, the website of Doxa, the journal that I told you about, that right now is not run by the 4 editors who are on trial, but by other people, and the website that really emerged in the last 2 weeks as one of the, let's say, if not main, but the most visible resources for Russian young people, encouraging them to go out into the streets and protest, and providing them with resources on how to behave in order to protect themselves on the internet, and what to do in case of their arrests. However, again, last week, Doxa website went dark, together with pretty much every single news outlet, independent news outlet in Russia. And the reason for that is a law, a so-called law about fakes, that went into effect on March 4th. So what is this law, for those who do not know? So this law was voted in by State Duma unanimously, and it threatens anyone who calls war by its name, and who not a special operation, but a full-on war in Ukraine, with 15 years in prison. The official formulation sounds like this: 15 years in prison for, quote, manufacturing and distribution of fake information that leads to socially dangerous consequences. Again, so the direct outcome of this law was the closure and the banning of all independent news outlets, and other platforms, cultural platforms that were very important for Russian society over the years, such as Kolta.ru or Sigma or others, decided to preemptively shut their gates themselves, because they're fearing for their journalists, and they're fearing the very real prospect of imprisonment. So the news outlets or cultural outlets that are still around are adopting an Aesopian speech. So for instance, if you log into the book review website called Gorky, you will not find a word about war in Ukraine. However, you will find a lot of, let's say, parables. Most of the books that they're reviewing right now are about war, invasion, and resistance that took place in other historical contexts. And the image that I have on the slide here is sort of another example of, again, Aesopian speech. This is an lost dog sign that was plastered onto the pole in Moscow, and it says, "Help find peace." On the 24th of February, the day when Russia started bombing Ukraine, peace has been lost somewhere nearby Kremlin. Without it, our banking cards are being shut down, our prices are going up, and the vitally necessary items and medication, such as medication, are suspended. With peace, we lost all of our dreams and hopes. Please help bring peace home, right? So this is an example of the way people try to circumvent this law about fakes by speaking in a way that is indirect, yet is clearly understandable to everyone. And just so you understand the scale of this internet shutdown that Russia is experiencing right now, I'm here to remind you that Roskomnadzor, the legal body that supervises all media in Russia, has blocked Twitter. It has blocked Facebook for the most part. It is still accessible, albeit only with a VPN. And today it was announced that Instagram too will be banned on March 14th. This is the direct response to Mark Zuckerberg's yesterday's decision to allow hate speech against Putin on Facebook. So here we have a retaliation. Okay. All right, so this repressive law against so-called fakes is a culmination of an attack on media that really ramped up around 2020 and kind of really picked up speed with the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, probably the most visible oppositional leader to date. So what is this law about fakes? I really wish I had access to the audience. I would know if you guys know about it or not, but I'll just go ahead and explain it. It is a law that was actually originally invented in the US. And this is the fact that Putin never forgets about mentioning. It is a law that allows to label organizations that are funded by foreign sources. However, the trick is that while in the United States, there were only, I think, 3 cases of people persecuted according to this law. And that was all in the immediate aftermath of World War II. In Russia right now, we have hundreds of people who have been labeled as foreign agents. So what happens is that, again, if a person receives a certain funding from abroad and they get labeled as a foreign agent, it doesn't mean that they immediately disappear from all screens and lose the means of broadcasting, but it means that they have to again, stop receiving this funding and label everything that they say with a long and annoying header saying that, well, this message has been brought to you by a foreign agent acting on behalf of foreign interests. And it's not only news organizations that can be labeled that, but individuals as well, right? So I think the first individual to be decreed to be a foreign agent was an artist from St. Petersburg called Daria Pakhonchich, and who is an educator and an artist. And it was not clear why exactly she was singled out. So in itself, being labeled as a foreign agent doesn't mean that one is criminalized. However, it is let's say it's a gateway position to then ramping up fees and finding further reasons to criminalize this whoever is being decided that they're a foreign agent in the long run. And perhaps the most dramatic and painful instance of this sequence of events is the story of the banning of the historical society called Memorial, which is one of the oldest historical societies in Russia. And that has been created with the explicit goal of studying, tracing, collecting information, building very extensive archives about the history of Stalinist repressions and political repressions in Russia in general, right? So at first they were labeled as foreign agents. And then this last year, Russian government made a movement to close them as having violated the rules of this sort of status of not labeling their posts enough or labeling in the wrong way. And as the result, on the 28th of December of this year, this society ceased to exist. The consequences of this closure are very hard to overestimate. It is a real tragedy, and it really does signal Russia's move towards full-on totalitarianism. And this is very extremely repressive gesture. So essentially, the history of Stalinist repression is now taboo. Right. So in other words, yes, there are protests. They're spontaneous, but constant and happen every day. And yet, at the same time, they're contingent upon the existence of functional internet and media. And as I've explained right now, Russian media, independent media is under unprecedented attack in Russia right now. And internet is under threat as well, in many ways, thanks to sanctions that are waged against Russia at the moment, right? Which, again, in turn, many of those sanctions threaten the lives of the very people who are opposing war and Putin's regime at the moment. So how do you survive this information blockade? Again, situation is changing every day, so we don't know what might happen tomorrow. But at the moment, people are circumventing this blockade by using VPN, by switching to Telegram, right? So right now, at the moment, Telegram is the main source of information about protests. It's the main source of information about what is going on in Ukraine for those who are located in Russia. Otherwise, this information is completely absent from mainstream media. and good old email newsletters. So right now, if you would like to read about Russian independent thought and oppositional activity, you have to subscribe to email newsletters from Doxa, Info. Republic is another good source. Perhaps they're Важная История, perhaps there are others that I'm forgetting. And then once a year, you will receive, once a week, you will receive a newsletter with a summary of news. So it has come to that. And also there is, again, in collaboration with Doxa, there appeared a site called Roskom Svoboda, which is a website of resources to people explaining what to do if their internet is shut down completely. Because this is, unfortunately, is a real possibility. And Roskom Svoboda is very vocal about the ways in which the pulling out of American media companies and the pulling away of sort of technical support that allows for the functioning of internet in Russia immediately puts into danger the lives of the most vulnerable young people who are opposing the regime and essentially taking away any means of their functioning. And as I've said before, there are people who are running Doxa and Roskom Svoboda trying to prepare for this, but obviously you can imagine the consequences that the complete internet shutdown will have on the abilities of people to organize. So you might ask, okay, so there are students, they're going on to protests every day, they get arrested en masse, but is there anything more? Are there political leaders, other political parties leading the protests? And the answer is no. All the politicians have, let's say, canceled themselves out at the moment. Navalny, just a few days ago, did urge people to protest the invasion of Ukraine, but he did it from prison, and there are no real political organizing happening besides that. So really what we're dealing with here are students, intellectuals, people in big cities left to their own devices to face the very, very heavily armed repressive police apparatus. Once again, I'll remind you that there are reports of beatings and tortures of those people in prison. And right now, they all can be arrested and sentenced for 15 years just by being seen on a rally holding a sign, "No to War." And I would like to conclude this sort of exposition of a catastrophe by reading to you excerpts from a few letters that I receive every day in bulk. Those are the letters from people trying to flee Russia and asking for support. I also receive letters from Ukrainian academics and scholars, but I just wanted to read you a few passages so that you can hear human voices behind them. So first letter: what is happening now does not fit into my head. My heart is broken. I feel horror and disgust. I openly protest against this war, against the horrific aggression waged by the country where I was born and raised. But I am terrified that for my actions, I can face from 3 to 15 years in prison. I'm looking for any possibility for my family and me to flee the country. Please help. Another letter: in light of recent events, I realized that living and working in my native country will be no longer possible. Me and all the people close to me are against the war, against the genocide of Ukrainian people and the conquest of foreign territories. My partner was twice arrested for picketing against war. There will be trials soon. We reckon that our work, freedom, and even lives are in great danger here. I'm keeping the original spelling here. We are looking for any work in the US. We have 3 children and we worry about their future, right? So you can really see the extent of horror, fright, shame, and also worry about a very direct prospect of being thrown into jail. And once again, I just want you to imagine the scale of this. I alone receive dozens of those letters every day, and people who are in Moscow and St. Petersburg right now are saying that their entire companies and circles of friends are trying to flee Russia by any means possible. So right now, some of the main enclaves of really newly minted immigration is Armenia and Turkey. People are leaving everything behind, their apartments, their professions, everything that they've been working for their entire life. And they're leaving without really any hopes for the future or money to support them. And those are the very people who were the, let's say, restraining force or the against Putin's totalitarianism, and also the voices of sanity in Russia. And I think it is our responsibility to protect them. And I think that this mission goes hand in hand with our efforts to support Ukraine and to build a better world. So I will stop at this, but I'm happy to take questions and hopefully we'll have a productive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anastasiya. And we have one question in the Q&A, actually now three. Natalia Plagman will read the first question.
Sure, we have the first question from Maria Werner. She is asking, and I will just read from her question. I have a question about why the new generation of activists are not expecting any help from the West. Well, there's certainly a degree of support for Russian opposition in democratic countries of the region and in the West. Do you think activists deliberately choose to represent their movement as theirs to avoid blame for being overtly influenced by the West or orchestrated by Western interests and to appear legitimate?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I would like to emphasize that those groups are not really trying to refrain from any interaction with Western media. They readily give interviews, and they have been supported by, let's say, Western academics. But at the same time, there's an awareness that besides sympathy, there's very little that people from abroad can do to protect them physically, right? So no letters of support or petitions will save Doxa editors, former editors right now, from going to prison, probably. Again, they haven't been convicted yet, but things are not looking good, right? And that pertains to almost all activists in Russia, right? So whereas with Pussy Riot, the sort of wave of outcry that happened in the West did ultimately give them a special standing and probably did play a part in their early release. The hundreds of newly minted political prisoners do not have the hope that the mechanism will work this way. And for that reason, they're reorienting their efforts from promoting their repression to, let's say, foreign media, to building their own media resources, building their prison support resources, creating guides on how to behave if you are to be arrested, and so on. So I think it's a sort of reorientation of resources and attention to essentially building an internal support network. And I did notice that over the last, let's say, year, almost everyone who was before involved in work around feminism and gender rights have really switched to mostly dedicating their work to prison support. Because it is over the last year, the number of political prisoners in Russia matched that of the late stagnation period. So again, prison is a real factor for everyone who is, let's say, growing up in Russia right now, and they're preparing for that. Do we have another one?
Yes, and Artemi will read the next one.
Artemi, I think you're muted.
So I'm muting myself. So the question, could you please comment more on the generation gap? Why is the younger generation more skeptical of state TV and propaganda compared to older people? And is this really the case?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I chose to focus on students today because I thought that will make the new generation of protesters relatable to our students in America, but there were members of all generations present at the protest as well. There were very kind of memorable images of an old woman in St. Petersburg who is, I believe, in her 90s right now, who survived the siege of Leningrad. That was the period when the German Nazi forces have encircled Leningrad, and there were almost 900 days of hunger as a result of the blockade. So she survived it, and last week she went into the streets with signs protesting against Russia's war in Ukraine and supporting the protesters. So that is to say that it's not exclusively young people. However, I do think that, well, young people have less to lose. They have a sharpened sense of justice. And also they grew up in the country where they've only had essentially, well, one president, with the exception of the period of Medvedev, when Putin and Medvedev switched roles, and they're fed up with that. They also had access to internet their entire lives, even if their travel was restricted. So they are in communication with the global world, and they have sort of models available to them that are absent on the state TV, and they sort of see it as irrelevant. So and also a lot of them were, let's see, came out of age after the period of the initial boom of prosperity that coincided with Putin's early year and the rising of the oil prices, right? So I think that is also a contributing factor, where they're growing up into the world where in which they don't believe that their lives will be stable, prosperous, and also they just don't buy into this ideology.
Okay, and our next question, Natalia, go ahead.
And I have just unmuted myself. So the next question I would like to read from Madeline Scarlett. She's asking, how have the protests evolved since the war began? Are they still maintaining numbers like we saw in the first days after the invasion began? And related to that, given the scale of arrests we're seeing right now, is it possible to maintain active demonstrations long term?
Thank you, Maddie. Well, the situation is changing so quickly, right? The full scale, I mean, of course, Russian war in Ukraine began 8 years ago, but this new full scale invasion started 2 weeks ago, and things have been, each day is bringing sort of new terrors and new blows. But I would say that just as a testament to the bravery of the people who are going out into the streets, is that shortly, 2 days after the passing of the law about fakes, right, that essentially threatens anyone who goes out with the banner saying that they're against war with 15 years of imprisonment, we saw the biggest rallies since the start of war, right? So the March 6th rallies were much bigger than, let's say, rallies that took place immediately after the invasion of Ukraine. That said, yes, people are trying to flee the country. They're frightened. There is no centralized political opposition. A lot of the 13,000 people who have been arrested are still serving their 15 days, most of them. So whether or not there will be kind of a new wave, I'm not sure. But the extent of desperation and terror that is just that is reported by everyone is overwhelming, right? So whether or not it will be realized as protest or effective protest, I have no way of predicting, but the sentiments have not abated. If anything, they became much more acute.
I'm going to ask the next one. This is from Peter Matthews. What about the older generations? Are they less informed about what's going on, or are they just resigned, or have they just learned not to care about politics?
I guess it depends on individuals, but we did see a letter that came out yesterday that one of my colleagues has translated into English, Anya Eisman, a letter that was signed by, I believe, 200, there was a letter in support of war that was signed by Russians academics. And I believe that there were nearly 300 signatures underneath it. And among them are deans of major state universities. And why they're doing this, whether because they lack a conscience, whether because they're afraid of losing their job, I have no way of saying, but I guess it doesn't matter. They've made their choices. Yes, there's also indifference. If you or kind of indifference to Ukraine. However, I would say that the extent of economic devastation that Russia is seeing right now is impossible to miss to anyone. And whether or not they will change people's opinions about Ukraine, or whether they will lead to Russia's further isolation from the West and impossibility of any peace negotiation, that's not for me to decide. But historically, sanctions never worked.
Got it. Okay, Artemy will ask the next question.
We have a question with several parts, but I will just read the first part, and it's coming from Julian Porter. From whom do the young Russian opposition leaders take their inspiration? From previous figures in Russian cultural history, the revolutionary radicals of the 19th century, the dissidents of the 20th century, or opposition leaders of the 21st, or from leaders of great civil rights struggles abroad? So that's
I would say that the Black Lives Matter movement is very influential and inspirational. Feminist struggles as well. As far as local examples of Russia's very unfortunately rich and long history of imprisoned dissidents, human rights activists, and writers, there is a sense of fatigue with that a little bit. And that's what I tried to illustrate with this poem by Alla Gutnikova. I would say that as far as doxa is concerned, it appears to me that they very deliberately try to flaunt their, let's say, ironic distance from, again, this much more heroic role that has been historically cultivated since the 19th century Russian sort of people's movements, and also by the Soviet dissidents, right? So unlike dissidents, they do not hope for the help from the West. They're much more ironic about their role. So I think also a kind of fascination with technology plays a role here, right? This kind of a lot of people who are running doxa are connected to computational linguistics, IT. So there is a sense of this kind of internet irony and humor, and to some extent the hope that maybe organizing media space will help you, but also combined with a sort of honesty about the, let's say, limited physical and psychological resources of every individual activist. So what's happening right now is interesting to me for many reasons, but also because it really does actively distance itself from the models that were kind of traditionally available to Russian intelligentsia of being in opposition.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I have a question that Eileen Brown has written here that I had the same question, so I would like to read hers. I hadn't thought of the fact that the sanctions and restrictions from PayPal, etc., are also hurting those who are resisting. Are there subversive ways to circumvent those sorts of restrictions, similar to how individuals have been booking Airbnb sites with obviously no intention of staying there? We're learning lots of ways to support Ukraine, which is great and necessary, but what about ways to support Russians who are resisting?
Excellent question. Thank you so much. And the answer is no. Because all of the companies like Airbnb have pulled away from Russia. Russia has been cut off from SWIFT codes, so you cannot transfer money there. So me and a friend of mine were trying to figure out how to transfer money to our friends who are in prison, and we managed to do it just in the nick of time, and now it's impossible. Right? And of course, it's not only protesters who people cannot send money to, but their aging parents or or their handicapped relatives trapped in Russia. So there's no way to transfer funds into Russia. Cryptocurrency is also not an option. We looked into that as well. There might be a possibility of transferring funds through China, but I haven't tried that yet. That might be a possibility. But so imagine waking up in the world where each form of financial transaction that was available to you online has been canceled. Also, even mailing delivery services like UPS and DHL, which were functioning in Russia before, no longer deliver mail in and out of Russia. So you cannot even send material help. So all of those possibilities of communicating are cut off, and it is the people who had very little resources to begin with. Many of them had, let's say, they may be freelancers, they worked in design or education, or maybe they had a small business and they sold some designer goods to the West. All of those possibilities of income are gone. Many people who worked as professors in the university have either been fired or have chosen to resign in protest. So they lost all means of livelihood, and there is no way in which we can help them. So this is, okay, once again, I'm Ukrainian. I do know what's going on in Ukraine, and this is terrible. But Russia is stumbling into poverty, and right now the situation is really dire. And once again, all of the means in which we could support Russian opposition are not available to us anymore, or at least right now.
Okay, Natalia.
Right, we have another question which comes from an anonymous attendee. Will we endanger our Russian friends if we write to them via social media or email asking them what they know about the war and if they themselves need anything?
I'm so sorry. Could you read the beginning of the question?
Yes. So the question is, will we endanger our Russian friends if we write to them via social media,
right,
or email asking them what they know about the war and if they themselves need anything?
I would say no. If people feel uncomfortable, they would not answer. Also, but it's always a good idea to use an encrypted service. So I recommend Signal. A lot of Russians switch to Signal. It is supposed to be somewhat protected. So if you're worried about communication, do that. Yeah. And I saw a question, so this is why my attention slipped, because I was reading another question, and I think Christina Tan asked about what we can do to help people in Russia. And I would say one is maybe spreading. So last week was very disturbing because there emerged a lot of anti-Russian prejudice where professors in Europe and students were denied their visas and told to return to Russia, which they of course left in the first place for a very specific reason. So I think one kind of changing this outlook and spreading public discourse that we are not discriminating on the national base principle, right? That we are allowing people we're judging people based on their actions and beliefs, not their nationality. So kind of publicly assuming this attitude, I think helps. And second, so right now there are several initiatives, which I'm also part of, within academia, trying to lobby for the creation of positions for Ukrainian refugees, but also for people fleeing the, let's say, cannibalistic regimes in Russia and Belarus. So if you are working in the art sphere, if you can think of any creative way of either helping people get their visas or maybe find employment opportunities in Europe, or actually a lot of people in Russia fled to Armenia, and they're probably, all of them are looking for work remotely. So if you can create those opportunities, that will be concrete help.
Anastasiya, there's one more question, and it's more of a legal nature. So thank you so much for the talk. It comes from my Nakur. I have a question about the role of the law in protest culture and the culture of resistance more generally right now. Mm-hmm. I've noticed that on my Telegram channels, an emphasis from many outlets, individuals, on what specific new laws mean for protesters, how to ensure that one's rights are respected when arrested, how to obtain conscientious objector status and avoid the draft. But given that the Russian authorities have shown themselves totally indifferent to legal norms, international and domestic, or willing to issue new regulations at the drop of a hat, what is the origin and or significance of this legalistic thinking?
Yeah, well, thank you, Maya. I wonder if we actually do have a little bit of a legacy of dissident thinking, where dissidents try to resist Soviet state by using Soviet laws, and how. But also, what else is there to do? However, we do have ample evidence to all of those laws being brutally disrespected. One of the things that I had for you today, but decided not to play, but you can listen to it yourselves, is a sound recording that was made by one of the arrested students. She smuggled in her cell phone and she had it on. So she's been arrested at the protest, brought into police station, and she's being interrogated. And she is invoking Article 51 of Russian Constitution that allows one not to answer questions that might be incriminating, right? So she's refusing to give information about her factual address, and so on. And she's being violently mocked by her interrogators and then beaten, right? And so this recording exists. It's with the subtitles. You can go to find it on Doxa's Instagram. And this is a very brutal illustration of exactly what you're talking about, that people are trying to invoke their rights. And I guess depends on the character of a policeman. Maybe if they're young and amenable to reason, that might work. But most often it just doesn't. But I guess what else do you have?
Nastya, it is now 4:32, and you've answered a lot of questions. Shall we call it a day, or what do you think? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. It was this talk was prepared very, very quickly on the spur of the moment. So thank you for bearing with me.
Oh, it was great. And there's been several questions asking for lists of resources that you mentioned in your talk. So we will prepare this as a recording, but maybe in addition, we could prepare a list of, in specific, it's a list of the, like basically all of the names that you mentioned so that we can check them out on our own.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And how will we circulate that? We can put it on our website.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So guys, our website is gsll.colorado.edu, and oops, it always corrects that. So go ahead to that website is where we will be able to circulate a list coming from this talk. Thank you all for attending, and we will post the recording. The link to the recording will also be on our website. Thanks everyone, and thanks Nastya so much.
Thank you.
Thanks you all.